There are moments in sports that stop being about the game entirely, where what's happening on the court becomes secondary to what's erupting around it. What you're about to hear is one of those moments. Except it didn't start with a buzzer beater, a trade, or a championship. It started with an ESPN profile, a single article published on a Tuesday morning in July 2026 that lit the entire WNBA on fire and forced the league's biggest star into the most uncomfortable silence of her career. By the time the smoke cleared, there were congressional letters, arena protests, a co-owner suspended, coaches taking political stances in front of cameras, and millions of fans taking sides on something that had absolutely nothing to do with basketball. And right in the center of all of it, two Indiana Fever teammates whose names you couldn't separate no matter how hard you tried. Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, one who changed women's basketball forever, and one who changed the conversation around it in ways nobody saw coming. But here's the thing. To understand how this blew up the way it did, you have to understand how we got here. Because the story of Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark didn't start with a controversial quote. It started with a stare-down that went viral across the internet. A shove that got someone ejected and a pattern of physical targeting so undeniable, it eventually pulled in Congress coaches and the commissioner of the league herself. This is the whole story from the very beginning to right now. And trust me, by the time we get to the end, you're going to see this situation in a completely different light. Most people had never heard of Sophie Cunningham before the summer of 2025. That's not an insult. It's just the reality. She was a journeyman guard, physical, tough, known more for her edge than her numbers. She'd bounced from Phoenix to Indiana, carved out a role as a reliable piece off the bench, and was largely flying under the radar. Then, Caitlin Clark arrived in the league, and everything changed, not just for Clark, but for Cunningham, too. The two became teammates in Indiana, and from the start, Cunningham made it clear she wasn't going to stand by quietly while her teammate got knocked around. And Clark was getting knocked around. We'll get to just how much in a minute. But the moment that turned Sophie Cunningham into a household name happened on a night when she didn't even take a shot. She just pointed. June 2025. The Fever are in a heated late-game situation, and Dana Bonner gets into a confrontation with Clark near the perimeter. Dana gets in Clark's space, and Cunningham, who sees the whole thing, walks over, locks eyes with Bonner, and just points at her silently for 22 seconds. No words, no shoving, just a stare that said everything without saying a thing. The clip went viral overnight. Suddenly, everybody knew who Sophie Cunningham was. But it was what happened just days later that truly launched her. On June 17, 2025, Connecticut Sunward JCS Sheldon shoved Clark to the ground. Cunningham didn't hesitate. She physically grabbed Sheldon and threw her down, was immediately ejected, and walked off the court like she'd done exactly what she intended to do. Fans lost their minds. Her Instagram following exploded. She went from roughly 700,000 followers to over 1.3 million essentially overnight. And she knew exactly why. She knew her rising platform was inseparable from her proximity to Clark. She even said so without flinching. What she did with that platform next is where this story gets complicated. Before we get to the controversy, let's spend a minute on the facts, because the facts here are genuinely startling and they matter. Since Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA in 2024, no player in the entire league has absorbed more flagrant fouls. Not one. In just 72 career games across regular season and playoffs, Clark has been on the receiving end of 9 flagrant fouls. That's one every 8 games. To put that in perspective, across that same stretch, the rest of the league combined saw only 4 other flagrant 2 fouls called, and all 4 of those were assessed in the moment. Clark's most serious incidents were repeatedly missed in real time and upgraded only after the league reviewed the tape. Let's run through the biggest ones. Just 10 games into her career, Shanette Carter hip-checked Clark on an out-of-bounds play. Clark didn't even have the ball. No call, nothing. The league later quietly upgraded it to a flagrant, but by then the message had already been sent. Then Marina Mabury shoved Clark to the ground in 2025. That one also required a retroactive upgrade to a flagrant 2. And then came June 24, 2026. Phoenix Mercury star Alyssa Thomas was fighting for a loose ball and drove a fist directly into Clark's throat. The officials watched it happen and let play continue. Thomas wasn't ejected. It wasn't even called a foul in the moment. The WNBA reviewed it and eventually upgraded it, suspended Thomas for 1 game, and moved on. Clark, meanwhile, left the game with a back injury. Sophie Cunningham had finally seen enough on her podcast, Show Me Something. She said it plainly. Opponents are definitely targeting Clark, and the league and the refs do nothing to protect her. Fever head coach Stephanie White backed her up publicly, describing what was happening as cheap shots. These weren't frustrated post-game rants from players blowing off steam. This was the team's coaching staff and the league's most visible personality going on record with something the numbers had been saying for months. And the response from the league, slow, reactive, and for a lot of fans, completely inadequate. Going into the 2026 season, the WNBA made changes, real ones on paper. The penalties for flagrant fouls were overhauled. Fines jumped from $200 to $500 per point, a 2.5 times increase. Automatic suspensions now kick in sooner. The league signaled, at least publicly, that the physical targeting of star players was something it took seriously. And heading into year 3, Clark herself set a goal, no more than 2 technical fouls all season. She told her coach Stephanie White directly, 2 max. She currently has 7 and she nearly had 8. That's not entirely Clark's fault. And this is where the officiating double standard argument gets its teeth. The pattern fans started documenting across the 2026 season was consistent enough to be alarming. Clark takes a hit, no call. Clark reacts, raises her arms, makes eye contact with a referee, gestures toward the play, whistle. Technical foul. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was the kind of thing you could clip, put side by side with another play, and post online without any commentary at all. The footage spoke for itself. Opposing players were making contact and walking away clean. Clark was glancing at officials and getting penalized. The moment that crystallized it came on August 8, 2026. During a Fever win over the Chicago Sky, Clark received her 8th technical foul of the season for what the official described as making extra contact with a referee. Under WNBA rules, 8 technicals triggers an automatic 1-aim suspension. Clark spoke to ESPN's Holly Rowe immediately after she said, "I ran into her. I've already watched it on the tape. I hope it gets rescinded." Then she cheekily told Rowe she'd see her at the New York game on Tuesday. The WNBA rescinded the foul within days. But the fact that it was called in the first place, and that it very nearly cost Clark a suspension, added another chapter to a story that was rapidly becoming impossible for the league to ignore. Congress eventually agreed. Lawmakers sent letters to Commissioner Kathy Angelbert urging stronger player protection policies. It was the kind of external pressure that leagues dread, and it was entirely avoidable if the officiating had been more consistent from the beginning. All of that, the flagrant fouls, the technicals, the congressional pressure, the coaching staff going public, was already a full storyline on its own. Plenty for one season. And then July 21st, 2026 happened. ESPN published a profile on Sophie Cunningham titled, "Love Her or Hate Her, Sophie Cunningham Won't Be Ignored." And buried inside that profile was a question about transgender athletes in women's sports. Cunningham answered it directly. She said she wanted to protect young girls in a locker room or young girls in sport who shouldn't have to go against biological men. She denied being anti-trans, framing her view as a matter of protecting female athletes and competitive fairness. She said she had received negative feedback accusing her of hating transgender people. Her response, "I never once said that. I think that I am here to extend love." The internet did not receive this calmly. Within hours, the story had spread across every major sports platform, news outlet, and social media feed in the country. Cunningham's comments became the story, not just in basketball circles, but nationally. And the setting it landed in made everything more combustible. The WNBA is one of the most politically progressive professional leagues in American sports. Roughly 67.5% of its players are registered Democrats, and the league has historically been outspoken on social justice issues. For a reserve guard on the league's most watched team to publicly stake out a position at such direct odds with the league's general culture was, to say the least, a flashpoint. What made it even more layered was the context. At the time of publication, there were no transgender women actively playing or preparing to enter the WNBA. The 2026 collective bargaining agreement had already established that only women are eligible to compete in the league. Cunningham was staking out a position on a policy debate that had no current practical application in the very league she played in. But that didn't cool anything down. If anything, it made the argument bigger, because it wasn't really about any specific player. It was about values, identity, and what kind of league the WNBA wanted to be. Cunningham doubled down the next morning without hesitation. I said what I said. I think it's kind of common sense. I'll always believe in that. She wasn't walking anything back. She wasn't apologizing or softening. She was standing exactly where she'd always stood and daring everyone to deal with it. Within days of that ESPN profile dropping, the Fever's road trip started looking less like basketball games and more like political events. An organization that advocates for legislation banning transgender people from women's sports began organizing rallies outside of Indiana Fever away games starting in Seattle. These were small but highly visible gatherings, coordinated, well-publicized, and impossible to miss. Fans showed up at arenas with pro-Cunningham signs. The imagery was sharp, intentional, and designed to make a statement. Things got particularly tense in Seattle. 2 teenage members of the pro-Cunningham group were sitting courtside during a Storm game, holding signs referencing her comments. A minority co-owner of the Storm confronted them. That confrontation was captured on camera, circulated widely, and the co-owner was subsequently suspended. It was exactly the kind of moment nobody in the league wanted. A front office figure publicly engaging with protesters at a game caught on video in a season already drowning in off-court noise. Cheryl Miller, the head coach of the Minnesota Lynx, took a different kind of stand before a game against the Fever. Miller appeared wearing a Trans Kids Belong shirt, a wordless but pointed statement aimed directly at the controversy surrounding their upcoming opponents. What made her approach notably different was that reports surfaced indicating Miller had actually met with Cunningham in person before making the gesture, a respectful private conversation before a very public statement. Miller spoke at length to reporters saying she didn't believe exclusion was ever an answer, and that she'd been pushing the WNBA to establish clearer transgender participation guidelines for years. The tension inside the Fever organization was becoming visible. After one game, both Clark and Cunningham violated the WNBA's media availability policy by declining to speak with reporters. It wasn't a minor note. It was a direct rule violation, and the league issued fines. The message from the Fever sideline was mixed. Coach Stephanie White emphasized inclusion in her public comments. Cunningham stood firm, and Clark said nothing. Her silence, as it turned out, was the loudest story of all. Here's where this gets genuinely complicated. Caitlin Clark is the most important player in women's basketball right now. Maybe the most important player in the history of the WNBA in terms of cultural reach and commercial impact. Her jersey is the league's bestseller. Her games drive television ratings to records the league had never seen before. Her Nike deal, 8 years, $28 million, is among the largest endorsement contracts in women's sports history. Every word she says or doesn't say carries enormous weight. So when Sophie Cunningham dropped her comments about transgender athletes and the world turned to Clark waiting for a response, the pressure was immense. Different groups wanted completely different things from her. Some wanted her to stand with her teammate. Others wanted her to speak out against the comments. Many simply wanted her to say something, anything, because her silence felt like its own kind of statement. It took Clark nearly 2 weeks to address it publicly. When she did, she was careful and measured. She said the issue was above my pay grade. She said it wasn't being discussed in the Fever locker room, at least not around her. She said leagues and governing bodies were the right people to figure it out, not her. And then she moved on. Not everyone accepted that. Jamal Hill, one of the most prominent sports media voices in the country, addressed Clark directly and publicly, asking essentially what she thought she was doing by staying silent when her platform was large enough to actually change the conversation. It was a pointed challenge, and it reflected a genuine tension. Clark has used her voice before. In June 2024, just 1 month into her rookie season, she put out a strong statement condemning the wave of racial abuse and harassment being directed at black WNBA players, including threats aimed at players like Alyssa Thomas. That statement mattered. It was noticed. So her silence this time felt more deliberate and for many people more disappointing. But there's another side to this. Clark is a 22-year-old athlete, 3 years into her professional career, already navigating sponsorship obligations, an expansion-era roster, a media storm that follows her to every road city, a technical foul controversy with the league, and physical targeting that has ranged from the embarrassing to the genuinely dangerous. The idea that she should also be required to serve as the political compass of the WNBA is a weight that says something uncomfortable about how much we expect from the players we make into icons. Clark isn't a politician. She isn't a league executive. She's a basketball player who also happens to be the most watched athlete in women's sports. Her silence may have been strategic. It may have been exhaustion. It may have been both. Either way, it made headlines for 2 weeks and counting. And through it all on the court, she kept doing what she does. This is the part that sometimes gets buried under all the noise, so let's give it the space it deserves. Caitlin Clark in 2026 is playing the best basketball of her career. Not close to her best, her actual best right now this season. She is averaging 21.5 points and 7.9 assists per game through 34 games. She's been healthy after an injury-racked 2025 campaign that limited her to just 13 appearances. That lost season was hard to watch. Clark played 13 games while her team somehow fought their way to within 1 win of the WNBA Finals before falling to the eventual champion Las Vegas Aces. This year, she came back like she had something to prove. The signature moment of the 2026 season came against the Seattle Storm. Clark scored 45 points, a career high, and added 10 assists. That made it the first 40-point 10-assist game in WNBA history ever. She did something nobody had done before in a league that has been running for nearly 30 years. After the game, she told reporters she was playing the best basketball of my career. Given the numbers, nobody argued. The Indiana Fever are 22-12 through 34 games. Playoff contenders, one of the hottest teams in the league. They've developed something genuinely fun to watch. A high-scoring, relentless offense that makes 100-point games feel almost routine in a league where they used to be rare. Clark is the engine of all of it, and around her, an actual team has formed. Aaliyah Boston anchoring the interior, a supporting cast that competes, and Sophie Cunningham, the enforcer, the provocator, and now one of the most followed athletes in women's basketball with over 1.3 million Instagram followers and counting, playing her role in every sense of that phrase. And then there's the shoe, because in the middle of all this chaos, the fouls, the technicals, the congressional attention, the trans controversy, the rallies outside arenas, Nike unveiled the Caitlin 1, Clark's first signature basketball shoe, dropping October 1st, 2026 at $140. Built around the traits she specifically requested, speed, range, and unpredictability, it features technology Nike has never put into a basketball shoe before. Hidden messages underfoot include, shoot more threes from anywhere, and it was never a long shot. The design is inspired by the ripple created by a three-point shot. Her interlocking CC logo appears throughout. Clark described it the way you'd expect from someone who has spent her whole life setting the bar higher. This is like your debut album. You want it to be killer. At this point, nobody expects anything less. Step back from the individual moments for a second and look at the full picture. Because what's happening around the Indiana Fever in 2026 is genuinely unlike anything professional women's basketball has seen before. The WNBA just came off its most watched season in history in 2025. Record television ratings, record attendance, record revenue, while simultaneously being a league so consumed by off-court controversy that its biggest storylines had nothing to do with basketball. Caitlin Clark did that not entirely by herself, and not always in the way people expected. Her presence didn't just grow the audience, it accelerated every tension that was already simmering in the league. Questions about officiating fairness. Questions about how veteran players treat rookies who arrive with exponentially more commercial power than them. Questions about the league's culture, its identity, and how it handles the messy reality of athletes saying things in public that don't always align with the organization's values. Caitlin didn't create those tensions, but her arrival made them impossible to ignore. Sophie Cunningham is a case study in what happens when proximity to a cultural phenomenon turns an overlooked player into a national figure. Before Clark, Cunningham was a solid reserve guard with a reputation for toughness. After 2 years beside Clark, defending her, fouling for her, pointing at opponents who tested her, speaking when Clark wouldn't. Cunningham has 2.88 million Instagram followers and one of the most polarizing public identities in women's sports. Some people love her for it. Some people think she's a distraction wrapped in a backup player's contract. The reality is probably both, and the WNBA has no rule book. What makes this moment so genuinely complicated is that almost nobody in it is entirely wrong. Cunningham isn't wrong that Clark has been targeted. The numbers make that inarguable. Clark isn't wrong to let the governing bodies handle questions about league policy. That's literally what they're for. The players speaking out about trans inclusion aren't wrong to believe their teammates and fans deserve a league with a clear, considered position. And the fans, who are simply exhausted by the amount of off-court noise drowning out actual basketball, they're not wrong either. Everyone has a piece of the truth, and none of them have the whole thing. What the league does next is the real question. The WNBA has two choices in front of it, and they couldn't be more different. It can continue handling these moments reactively, upgrading fouls 2 days after they happen, rescinding technical fouls after the fact, staying quiet until the pressure from Congress or the media forces a response. Or it can get ahead of it, establish clearer officiating standards, develop a real policy on player conduct and league values that doesn't require a controversy to trigger a conversation, protect its stars on the court before the hits happen rather than after, and decide clearly what it actually stands for, not just in press releases, but in the rules it enforces and the behavior it tolerates. Because right now, the league's most watched team is generating more headlines for arena protests and ESPN profiles than for basketball. And the player at the center of it all, Caitlin Clark, is averaging career highs, breaking records that have never been broken before, and still somehow finding herself in the middle of every fight the WNBA hasn't figured out how to have. So here's where things stand. As of right now, the Indiana Fever are 22-12 and climbing. Caitlin Clark is playing like she's on a mission, and based on what you've just heard, she probably is. Sophie Cunningham is one ESPN profile away from being either the WNBA's most courageous voice or its biggest liability, depending on who you ask. The league is still processing a summer that featured flagrant foul controversies, congressional intervention, a co-owner suspension, and protests outside arenas and cities across the country. And the Nike Caitlin 1 is dropping in October, which means the commercial machine around Clark is only getting bigger. None of this is over. Operation Balance, as the competitor video framed it, was always a convenient shorthand for something far messier and far more real. The WNBA is a league at war with its own growth. A league that desperately needs what Caitlin Clark brings while also being threatened by it. A league where the rules for physical play are being tested in real time. Where the relationship between its culture and its individual players is fraying at the edges, and where one player's presence has made every old question feel brand new. The most interesting thing about Caitlin Clark isn't the records, it's not the shoe, it's not even the targeting. It's that after 3 years of everything, the fouls, the silence from teammates, the inconsistent officiating, the technical fouls, the controversy surrounding the people around her, she is still there, still shooting, still averaging career highs, still the most watched athlete in women's basketball, still writing the story one play at a time. The WNBA will be remembered for this era. The only question left is whether history remembers it as the moment the league rose to meet its moment, or the moment it almost let its own future slip through its fingers. That question doesn't have an answer yet, but it will. And when it does, you can bet Caitlin Clark will be at the center of